Hi, my name is Christina and I am a sports dietitian with Memorial Hermann Ironman Sports Medicine Institute. And as part of my role at Ironman, I get the opportunity to go on a few of our local high schools' campuses and provide some nutrition counseling and education to the athletes and coaches and occasionally the parents too. So today I just wanted to talk about some nutrition considerations for the high school athlete and just touch on some things that I have seen in my practice working with these athletes. So we're going to go over, some common nutrition habits of teen athletes, talk about some fueling recommendations for them, maybe how we can fill some of the gaps that exist. And then at the end, I'll just kind of wrap up with some consequences of underfueling. So if we are kind of missing some of those recommendations. So one thing that we do and that we found kind of helpful is we use surveys. So we just use Google Forms, but we send out kind of weekly or bi-weekly surveys to our athletes at the high schools that we're consulting at. And really this kind of helps us paint a picture of, what they're doing outside of school. And when we're not there, obviously we're only there once a week at the most, sometimes only twice a month. And so kind of getting an idea of what they're doing the other days of the month has been enlightening and what their nutrition habits look like. So we send out a survey, and one of the questions that we ask is, how many meals are you consuming a day? And I think this is one of the biggest things that I've seen, one of the biggest kind of pitfalls that I've seen with our high school athletes is that they're really not consuming food or fuel frequently enough for the amount of activity that they're doing. So you can see I kind of included some pre-COVID and post-COVID data here, which has changed a little bit, but really not a ton. So you can see pre-COVID, about half of our athletes were consuming at least 3 meals a day, which is okay. But really, we'll talk about why they should probably be consuming a little bit more. About 40% we're getting kind of that 4 to 5 meals and snacks per day, which is great. But then we can see we've got about 10% here that are only consuming 1 or 2 meals. So maybe they're missing breakfast in the morning, maybe they are skipping lunch, or, for whatever reason, missing out on some opportunities there. And then on the post-COVID, we can see we've got about the same, right around 50% of our athletes that are consuming about 3 meals a day. We can see that number of 4 to 5 meals a day has shrunk a little bit, which is interesting. But we do see actually more of those 6 or more meals per day. And so maybe that's due to just access. So them having access to the fridge, more frequently, being home a little bit more. And then unfortunately too, we see kind of a jump in that 1 to 2 meals per day. So, maybe they're waking up later in the day now, since they don't have to go to school physically. Maybe they're not training as much. They're not as hungry. But I think it's still important that we are eating pretty consistently and that our teen athletes are eating pretty consistently. So I think one of the biggest barriers to getting the appropriate number of meals and snacks in is their schedule. And so, a lot of times they're starting pretty early in the morning. Lunch is really variable depending on, what school you're at and then what lunch you have. So I have athletes that have the A lunch and they end up eating more of a brunch at 10:15 or 10:30, and then they've got to go the rest of the day until about 2:30, 3 o'clock with, limited opportunities for food. Some athletic periods will vary. So, we've got athletes who train really early in the morning before school and into first period. There's some that train in the middle of the day, and then there's some that train at the end of the day. And then a lot of the times when sports are in season, they will also train in the afternoons as well. And so it's really variable for a lot of the athletes. And so kind of helping them understand, trying not to go too long without fueling, and maybe helping them fill some of those gaps or some of those long periods of time where maybe maybe they don't have a meal built in, and they have to train during that time as well. So here's an example that's a pretty common one that I see. So maybe this athlete has first period athletics, and so oftentimes they're coming in 6:30 in the morning and starting their practice before school, and then kind of wrapping up towards the end of first period. And then they may even have after school practice. So that may be school, or that may be some kind of club sport that they're involved with. And so they're waking up super early. They're training. And then, depending on when their lunch is, a lot of times these athletes end up having a little bit earlier lunch just based on their class schedule. And so, they're training super early. Maybe they're getting, some kind of brunch in around 10:30, but then they've got to train again later in the afternoon. And that's about 4 hours of time where they're not consuming anything. And then they're supposed to go to another hour and a half, 2 hour practice after that. And they're running on fumes by then. So looking for some opportunities to kind of put in some meals or snacks. So definitely after that early morning training, we've worked a lot with our cross country kids, especially they tend to be training pretty early, and even some of our swimmers, on having, a good recovery meal. And we'll talk a little bit about what that should look like. And then, maybe there's another opportunity for them to grab another snack before they go into that after school practice. So if it's been a while since your lunch, and then you've got to go practice for another hour and a half, 2 hours, then can we get something in before you head into that? Another common one that I see is our fifth period athletes. A lot of the times this is your varsity football team, maybe basketball or baseball as well. Sometimes some of the women's sports too. And so, they come into school, maybe they've eaten breakfast, maybe not. And then they've got, their class periods until their fifth period, which is normally around like 11-ish. And then they've got to train for that. And then they go to lunch. And then a lot of times they'll be training in the afternoon as well. So looking for some fueling opportunities there. A lot of time I encourage those kids to bring a snack with them. So please eat breakfast if at all possible, and actually having another kind of snack that maybe they eat during third or fourth period or on their way to fifth period, just something small to kind of give them another energy intake opportunity before they go into that fifth period. And then we'll get the lunch after. And then even some of my guys prefer to bring some kind of extra snack in for that kind of gap between their fifth period and their post school practice. So ideally what we're seeing is we've got our athletes consuming somewhere between 4 to 6 meals and snacks throughout the day. And that puts them eating about every 3 to 4 hours. And then thinking about surrounding these training sessions with appropriate fueling. So making sure they're getting what they need before and that they're recovering after. So in this green box here, you can kind of see just an idea of what a meal layout could look like for an athlete. So kind of a couple things to note. So, they're not going too much longer than 3 or 4 hours between these meals, and they're getting pretty consistent amount of protein at this meal. And so that's one point that I really try to emphasize with my athletes, especially my male athletes. So most of them kind of understand, protein is important for muscle, right? But what a lot of them try to do is eat really large protein meals 1 or 2 times a day, when in reality, it's going to serve them a lot better to spread that protein out a little bit more consistently throughout their day. So you can see in the box here, they're getting about 15 to 30 grams, so that 0.25 to 0.4 grams per kilogram per meal will come out to somewhere around 15 to 30 grams for most of your athletes. And then they're getting that every 3 to 4 hours. So to hammer home this idea, I like to use this illustration of the brick wall. So your muscle is a brick wall, right? So in your muscle, you've got one guy who's building it up and you've got one guy who's breaking it down. So your brick wall is made of bricks, your muscles are made up of protein, right? And so in order to get proteins to continue that building and repair of the brick wall, we've got to get protein in our diet, right? So we eat a good protein meal, that protein comes down, and it's there, it's available for our brick builder. So the one caveat though is that that protein is on a conveyor belt. And so, we eat that protein meal, and then for about 3 or 4 hours after that meal, we have, our brick builder can take those bricks and he can build onto that wall. But after 3 or 4 hours, those bricks kind of move down the conveyor belt and he no longer has access to them. But that brick breaker never stops. And so, prolonging time in between meals or skipping meals is missing out on opportunities for building muscle. And so getting that protein in every 3 to 4 hours and getting it in that kind of moderate dose is really what's appropriate. Eating really large doses of protein isn't going to be any more beneficial than probably that 15 to 30 grams as far as muscle protein synthesis goes. And you may actually be missing out on feeding opportunities down the road because protein is really satiating. So if you eat a really big protein meal, you may not be hungry when it comes time to eat that protein again. So again, really just try to hammer that home, especially with my guys. They seem to just want to eat tons and tons of protein, but kind of helping them structure that a little bit can help. So also thinking about, how we are fueling before we go into training. And so, training or competition. So I really like this graph. I think it's a good illustration. So you can see 4 hours out, our pre-training or pre-competition meal can be pretty large, and it can include mostly carbohydrate, but it can also have a little bit of fat and protein in that meal as well. Since we're consuming it 3 or 4 hours out, we're giving our body time to digest those things fully. So protein and fat, and then also fiber from things like vegetables, will slow down our digestion. So the closer that we get to training time, we see that we're losing that fat and protein amount. And then we're really just kind of honing in on carbohydrates in that time right before training or right before competition. So just to give you guys a few examples, if you're eating about 3 hours before, so maybe this is the lunch before your after school training session, we want to focus on carbohydrates, right? So we want to make sure that we're getting in, that energy source, which is our carbohydrates. We can have about 20-30 grams of protein again, so we can hit that protein synthesis there. And then we can include, fats and veggies and things like that, because we're giving, our digestive system enough time to kind of move those things along before we start exercising. So this is where the good old turkey sub sandwich comes in. I know it's a really popular choice for pre-game meals. And, I think it's a good choice, right? We're getting in good carbohydrates with the bread. We can find lean proteins with turkey or chicken breast. We can kind of control, we can limit, cheese and fats and things like that. And we can throw a little bit of veggie on there if we want. As we get a little bit closer, 1 or 2 hours before, you can see that meal volume just shrinks a little bit. So really we're still focused on carbs, but we're maybe limiting that protein and definitely that fat a little bit. So thinking about maybe a breakfast before a training session, if we're going to give it an hour or so, you could think about this may be an option for your summer conditioning. So if your athlete wants to wake up about an hour or two, just kind of depending on when that conditioning starts, they could get something like 1 or 2 scrambled eggs, an English muffin. So we're getting some carbs, and then, you can add a little jam on there to get a little bit more carbs. You could have a little bit of juice or water, right? So we're getting fluids in before. And then that hour before, so this is probably the one that I can recommend the most for a lot of my athletes. These tend to be the easiest things for them to just throw in their bag and pack along. And that's probably the easiest thing. This is the easiest gap to kind of fill that, 45 minutes to an hour, that period before their training session. If they haven't had a meal in the past 2 to 3 hours, all right, let's make sure, or 3 to 4 hours. Okay, here's, what's something quick and easy that you can kind of have on hand and consume, so you're not going into that last training session just completely drained or without any energy. easy things, a banana, granola bar, bring some raisins with you, pretzels, applesauce, right? Things that are going to be easy for them to just kind of have on hand. And again, we're looking at mostly just carbohydrate. We really don't need a ton of protein or fat going into that training or competition. And then post-training, obviously we want to think about the 3 R's of recovery. So replenishing the carbohydrates that we just used up in our training or competition. We want to repair with protein. So we're thinking about, again, that 15 to 30 grams ish. And then rehydrating. So especially as you guys start training in the summer, it may be helpful to weigh in and out of your training. So likely there will be some weight loss. That's not true weight loss. Really, that's just weight loss from fluid or sweat. And so for every pound that the athlete loses, they need to think about consuming about 20 to 24 ounces of fluid. I think this will be especially pertinent, if you have athletes that are training more than once in a day. So it's really important that they're putting that fluid back in before they go into that second training session. Or if you're starting 2-a-days in August, again, when it's still pretty hot outside, weighing in and out is a pretty easy and effective tool to make sure that you're hydrated going into your next training session. So here's some snack options. Again, if maybe your athlete isn't going to sit down to a meal, or they don't have the opportunity, they need something that's a little bit more convenient. So, something like a turkey sandwich where you're getting protein from the turkey, we're getting some carbohydrates from that bread, we're getting a little bit of color. Maybe if we throw some veggies on there, some lettuce and tomato, and then, that chocolate milk will have protein and carbohydrates and fluid, right? Sometimes the athlete doesn't feel like eating a full meal. They don't have much of an appetite, especially after a harder training session or when it's been really hot outside. So I think that's where liquids can be really helpful. So I like these Core Power shakes. They're milk-based, nice protein profile. If you have an athlete that's dairy intolerant or has some issues with dairy, Muscle Milk has some non-dairy options, and there's no shortage of protein drinks out there. One thing to note about protein drinks these days is that they tend to be a little bit lower carbohydrate, just due to kind of consumer demand. And so if it is a little bit lower in carbohydrate, make sure that you're adding a carbohydrate source. So take a banana with you, half a sandwich, something like that. And then if you're tired of chocolate milk or protein drinks, I like these tuna packets. They're super easy, shelf stable. You can just kind of throw them in your bag and, get some carbs from crackers. We can get a little bit of color with that fruit, some grapes or something like that, and then making sure you're also bringing fluid. So water, again, a sports drink, if it's been really hot and they've been training outside for more than an hour, then a sports drink might be appropriate in that setting. And then if they're going to sit down to a meal, I think plate models are the easiest way to think about how you're going to build your meal. So, we've got protein, we've got carbohydrate, and then we've got veggies, or I like to just call it color, fruit and veggies on there. And so protein pretty much stays the same. Again, we're always looking for that 15 to 30 grams. The carbs will kind of vary depending on the intensity of the training. So an easier or an off-season day when there wasn't a ton going on, we don't need a ton of carbohydrates. So I tend to tell them, think about like a fist-sized portion on those days. Moderate training is kind of just going to be your average in-season training day. And then a hard training day would be those days where maybe they're training twice in a day, or it's a day or a night before a game or a meal before a game, right? So on that moderate training day, thinking like 1.5 to maybe 2 fists of carbohydrates. And then on that hard training day, definitely at least 2 fists of carbohydrates is an easy way to think about it. All right, so lastly, I just kind of want to touch on what are some of the potential consequences if athletes underfuel. So this is something that I've been pretty passionate about in female athletes, but it's also something that can really impact our male athletes as well. So this idea of relative energy deficiency syndrome in sport, or REDS, you may or may not have heard of it. If you've heard me talk, I've probably talked to you about it. But it's this idea that we're kind of operating at a low energy availability. So if you think about kind of energy in versus energy out, so that energy out, that total energy expended, in a day for your athlete, obviously includes exercise, right? But it's also including their resting metabolic rate, and those activities of daily living, everything else that they need to do, all of that kind of background calorie burn that's going on without us even thinking about it. So that still takes energy, right? Energy availability is this idea of, the total energy that we're intaking from our diet, and then we're subtracting the energy that we use for, athletics or training, right? So how much energy is left over then for all of those kind of like background functions that are kind of going on in our body? And so low energy and availability happens when that energy that's kind of left over after we're training from our food intake is less than what's needed to kind of cover all of those other things that our body needs to do. And so essentially what happens is when we operate at low energy availability, we don't have enough money to pay the bills, right? And so things are going to kind of start shutting down. And so how we kind of understood this early on was the female athlete triad, right? So we know it's really well documented, low energy intake, low energy availability ends up in menstrual function disruption. And that also kind of ties into this bone health. So we see increases in bone injury. And so what we've kind of learned in the past few years is that, we can actually kind of expand this definition a little bit. So beyond just menstrual function and bone health, this low energy availability can impact a lot of other different physiological systems. And it can also include male athletes. So the female athlete triad is exclusive to females, but relative energy deficiency syndrome we see in both males and females. And so you can see it can really affect a lot of different systems. And I think for our high school athletes, really thinking about this growth and development. So are we stunting growth and proper development because they're missing meals, they're not fueling enough before or after their training, right? And so that's kind of my biggest concern when I'm working with these athletes. And then you can see performance consequences. So I can talk to them about, bone health and, other ways that low energy may affect some of their body systems. But really what matters to them is performance. And so you can see that, decreased muscle strength, decreased endurance performance, increased injury risk. This is the biggest one. Athletes that are operating at low energy availability are 4.5 times more likely to have some kind of bone injury. But also, thinking about like nagging soft tissue injuries, things that just keep cropping up and won't heal. Like, can we look into their diet? Can we look into their daily habits? Are they consuming frequently enough? Are they consuming enough nutrients? And so I think that's something that we need to start investigating a little bit more. Obviously, impaired immune response is a big one, but then also, we're just not getting as much of a response to training, despite how hard we're training, if we're not providing enough energy and fuel for our body. And so just kind of wrap it up, some of these key takeaways and, good nutrition does not have to be hard. And so I really, especially for our high school athletes, a lot of them want to kind of jump into all of this like fancy stuff, and we really need to build a good foundation. And so that starts with consuming 4 to 6 meals and snacks a day, really not going too much longer than 4 to 5 hours in between those feedings, and then thinking about that meal structure. So, when I'm eating a meal or a snack, do I have a carbohydrate? Do I have some kind of protein? If it's not too close to competition, am I getting a protein? Can I find some color, fruits and vegetables, right? Can I work those in? Those are really important for nutrients. So vitamins and minerals, those are the best sources of those. And it's something I think athletes really struggle with in my experience. And then, am I getting appropriate amounts of fluid? Restriction is rarely the answer, right? So skipping meals, cutting out food groups, putting yourself at risk for that low energy availability. I think I see this a lot in my female athletes. They want to restrict, they want to make their body smaller with the idea of my performance is going to improve, when in reality, they're probably doing a lot more damage. And so I see this in females, but it's not exclusive to females. I've seen it in males too. So again, this idea of, not meeting those energy needs, not fueling as consistently enough is really going to be detrimental to their growth and development and performance as athletes. And then lastly, proper fueling powers great performance. And so everybody wants to be great. Everybody, wants to go out and be the star in the field, but very few high school athletes are thinking about what they're putting in their body to do that. So just trying to get them to think about that and take some easy steps towards improving their daily nutrition. All right, thanks.